My mum's sick, so I came instead. Maid's daughter walked into Billionaire's office. What happened when 12-year-old Grace Thompson stepped into Ashford Tower, the gleaming headquarters of one of Chicago's largest real estate empires? She carried nothing but an old leather satchel and a gaze lit with quiet determination. The security guard moved toward her almost immediately. Sleek business suits swept past her in a blur of indifference. She stood, small and unnoticed, amidst the hurried footsteps and the cold light reflecting off walls of glass. On the 52nd floor, Walter Ashford, the man who held all the power in that building, was preparing to have her removed from the lobby. But what he did next would leave everyone stunned, because those massive glass doors were never meant to open for someone like Grace. Behind that glass was the only chance her family had left to keep from being evicted from their rundown apartment on the south side of the city. The interview her mother was supposed to attend would begin in less than 30 minutes, but this morning Rachel Thompson couldn't even sit up. Fever clouded her eyes, her skin was pale and cold, and every cough shook her frail frame like it might tear her apart. Morning light, silver and dim, streamed through the window, illuminating the dust that hung in the icy air. The silence in the room was so heavy that even the ticking of the old wall clock rang out with eerie clarity. The heat had been shut off 3 days ago. Between food and warmth, her mother had chosen food. For her daughter, she always chose hunger for herself. Grace had sat at the kitchen table, watching her mother tremble beneath a thin blanket. Their tiny apartment held only a mattress, a battered dining table, and a handful of worn-out belongings. The gas stove bore dark burn marks along its sides. The fridge stood open and empty. She said nothing, just watched, then turned to the calendar hanging on the wall, where the 15th had been circled in harsh red ink with a single phrase written beside it: "Move-out day." Only 3 days remained. When her mother called to ask if the interview could be rescheduled, the voice on the other end was firm, cold, and final. The Ashford Group does not reschedule for anyone. If she was not present at 9 o'clock, her file would be immediately discarded. Grace heard it all. Every word sank like a blade into her chest. She watched her mother's hand shake, saw the phone slip from her fingers. Another fit of coughing tore through her as her body curled inward. Then she lay back down, pulling the thin blanket over her chest, gasping for breath. Grace walked to her, gently placed her cold hand on her mother's burning forehead. Rachel's eyes were open but weary, burning red with fever. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered. "I ruined everything." But Grace shook her head. "No, you need to rest." Then she turned and quietly walked out of the room. The photograph of her grandfather rested on a weathered wooden shelf by the window. A black and white image of him standing among fellow soldiers, his uniform rough and worn, his eyes sharp, his jaw clenched with resolve. Sergeant Henry Thompson, a man who had lived and died like a warrior. The man who once told Grace that fear is a reaction, but courage is a decision. When the hill grows steep, the soldier does not turn back. He climbs. She looked at her mother one last time, then walked to the chair where Rachel had laid out her interview clothes the night before. A clean white blouse, black trousers, and the old leather satchel that had once belonged to Henry Thompson. Inside were a resume, a few certificates, and a letter written in blue ink. Grace, dressed in her Sunday best instead. A white blouse that was already a little tight across the shoulders, a pleated navy skirt that brushed against her knees, and a grey cardigan with a frayed collar. She polished her black school shoes until they shone, brushed her hair into a neat ponytail. Before leaving, she wrote a small note and placed it beside her mother's bed. Went to get soup. Back soon. Love, Grace. The cold outside was bitter, biting through alleyways like invisible blades. Grace walked to the bus stop, clutching the leather satchel to her chest. The driver looked at her once, said nothing. But a woman across from her leaned in and asked, No school today, sweetheart? Grace lifted her chin, steadied her voice. I have an important appointment. The woman raised an eyebrow, then looked away. Ashford Tower came into view after the third turn, a massive structure of steel and glass that loomed against the grey winter sky. Its polished face reflected the heavens like an emotionless mirror. Grown-ups streamed past Grace in a never-ending current, each one busy, none looking at the other. Grace stood at the foot of the steps and looked up. For the first time she felt her legs tremble, but then she remembered her grandfather's voice. Strength is not the absence of fear, it is walking forward in spite of it. She tightened her grip on the satchel, stepped up the wide stone stairs, and pushed through the heavy revolving door. No one noticed the little girl entering the building. No one could have imagined that just minutes from now, everything in that towering empire would come to a pause. Because of a girl who had nothing in her hands but love for her mother, and the memory of a man who had once been saved in a place far away many years ago. You're listening to a heartfelt story from Emotional Echoes, where we share powerful journeys that inspire, move the soul, and restore faith in kindness amid the rush of everyday life. If Grace's story and her mother's unwavering strength have touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with others, so this message of humanity can reach even further. We return every day with new stories, honest and profound, offering you a warm and hopeful perspective on the world around us. Where are you watching from today? Leave us a comment below with the name of your city or country so we can see just how far this story has traveled on the map of compassion. And now, we invite you to continue following the next chapter of this moving journey. Grace's footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floor, the sound delicate and clear, like distant raindrops on stone. At 12 years old, she looked impossibly small within the grand, gleaming expanse of Ashford Tower's lobby, a single drop in a frozen sea of glass and silence. The space was so still that she could hear her own shoes tapping against the floor, the echoes slipping between towering marble columns like whispers. Men in dark suits and women wrapped in elegant wool coats passed by without stopping, not a glance spared for the girl in a worn grey cardigan, her neatly tied hair and the old leather satchel clutched tightly in her arms. She approached the reception desk, a wide counter of walnut wood that stretched over 10 feet, behind which sat a silver-haired woman with a crisp posture, frameless glasses, and a voice as sharp and tidy as the lines on her keyboard. She was speaking into the phone, typing swiftly, eyes never leaving the screen. Grace waited quietly, patient. After a moment, she cleared her throat softly. The woman didn't look up. Grace rose on her toes, but even then, she barely reached over the top of the desk, so she raised her voice, just a little. "I'm sorry," she said. "I need to speak with someone in the hiring department." At last, the woman paused and glanced around, as if searching for the voice. Her brows pinched together in mild suspicion when her eyes found the child. "Are you lost?" she asked, not unkindly, but without a trace of patience. Grace shook her head. "No. I'm here for an interview." The woman blinked. "An interview? I'm Grace Thompson. My mother is Rachel Thompson. She had a job interview for the cleaning position here at 9 o'clock this morning, but she's very sick. She couldn't get out of bed, so I came instead." The words dropped into the air like a stone into still water. For a moment, the entire lobby seemed to pause. The receptionist stopped breathing. A man stepping into the elevator turned to look. A security guard nearby narrowed his eyes. Grace tightened her grip on the satchel. The light from the crystal chandelier above cast her small shadow onto the cold white tile beneath her. The receptionist shook her head slowly. "Sweetheart, this isn't a place for children to wander. You need to step outside, right away. This is a secured area. You're not allowed to be here." "But if my mum doesn't show up, they'll take her off the list. I just want to leave her application, that's all. She really needs this job. We really need it." Grace's voice trembled slightly, but her tone was firm. The receptionist said nothing. Instead, she picked up the internal phone. "I'll have security escort you out." "No, please, just a moment." Grace's voice rose, louder than she meant it to. Her words echoed through the marble hall, and a few more heads turned. Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "Please, I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to drop off her file." "1 minute, that's all." The receptionist gripped her headset more tightly, finger hovering over the button. But then, a voice low, commanding, unmistakable, spoke from behind Grace, freezing the room like a sudden shift in wind. "What's going on here, Martha?" The air in the lobby changed instantly. The woman behind the desk stood up at once, smoothing her jacket. "Mr. Ashford, it's nothing serious. Just a little girl who's wandered in. She claims she's here for an interview." A faint, unreadable smile touched the face of the tall man who had just stepped from the private elevator. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his charcoal suit sharp and understated. Walter Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Group, looked down at the child standing before him. His eyes darkened slightly. She was so small. The satchel she carried was nearly half her size. His voice was low, measured, laced with faint irritation. "What are you doing here, young lady?" Grace drew a breath. "I'm Grace Thompson. My mum is Rachel Thompson. She had an interview scheduled with your company this morning, but she's very sick, so I came instead. I didn't want anyone to think she wasn't serious. I just want to give you her application. That's all I ask. Please, just look at it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. Ashford said nothing at first. He studied her, from the carefully polished shoes, to the hands that trembled ever so slightly, to the steady gaze in her eyes. A child, trying to do the work of an adult. A child who didn't appear fearless, but one who had clearly learned to carry fear like a familiar companion. He turned his eyes toward the security guard and gave the faintest wave of his hand. "Take her to the 52nd floor. Call Jenkins." The receptionist blinked in disbelief. "But sir, the board meeting." He didn't answer, just a look, and no one dared speak again. Grace didn't know what had just happened, but in that moment, for the first time all day, she didn't feel alone. She followed the guard toward the elevator, the old leather satchel still clutched tight in her hands. In her heart, hope flickered again, and with every step forward, her heartbeat grew stronger, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty that she was doing what was right. As the elevator carried Grace upward to the highest floor of Ashford Tower, her story was still unfolding, far from all that polished elegance and steel, beginning instead in a neighborhood where the cold slipped through every crack in the walls and poverty clung to her family like a second skin. The Thompson apartment sat inside an aging building on the south side of Chicago, where brick walls wore the stains of time and the hallways always carried the faint scent of mildew. That morning, when sunlight filtered weakly through grey clouds, it passed through a thin curtain into their cramped room, casting a pale glow that caught on the dust, drifting slowly in the cold air like tiny pieces of ash. The floor was so cold that each step sent a sting up through bare skin. The heat had been shut off 3 days earlier when the gas bill went unpaid. Rachel Thompson had tried, scrambling to gather what little she could, but time ran out. In the end, she used what remained to buy food for her daughter, and then illness came, sudden and merciless, pulling her under wave after wave of fever. That morning, just before Grace boarded the bus bound for Ashford Tower, the apartment remained dim and silent, except for the coarse, splintered sound of Rachel's coughs. It echoed through the small space like a tree branch cracking in the wind. She lay curled on a thin mattress, under a blanket too light to hold in her warmth. Her brown hair clung to her forehead with sweat, her face flushed red with fever, while her lips had turned a worrying shade of blue. Each time she tried to rise, The dizziness returned like a tide, forcing her to sink back into the bed. Once, this woman had juggled 3 jobs to raise her daughter. Now, her strength was gone, and her eyes flickered unfocused in the grey morning light. When the alarm buzzed softly beside her, she reached out to silence it, but her hand trembled so badly that the phone slipped and fell to the floor. Rachel took in a shaky breath, tried again, each effort splintering her breath into broken, gasping fragments. Grace sat just a few feet away on a worn kitchen chair by the old table. She watched her mother with eyes filled not only with worry, but something steadier, something resolved. Her mother had fought too, long, too hard. Grace had seen her push through pain countless times, always saying that tomorrow would be better. But this morning, even drawing a breath looked like a battle. When Rachel finally managed to speak into the phone, her voice sounded like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. She tried to explain, tried to say it was only a fever, that she just needed one more day. But the voice on the other end was cold, clipped, as precise and unforgiving as winter wind. The Ashford group did not reschedule for anyone. If she was not present at 9 sharp, there was no point in showing up at all. The call ended with a flat tone that seemed to press down on the air like a closing door. Rachel let the phone fall from her hand, and her eyes lost something then, as if whatever she had hoped for had slipped quietly away, not just the job, but something deeper, more sacred. Grace ran to her mother's side, pressing her cold hand against her mother's burning cheek. Rachel tried to smile, but the effort crumbled as another wave of coughing bent her body forward, shaking her frame. When it passed, she lay back, chest heaving, her breath jagged like broken glass. "I'm sorry," she whispered between gasps. "I ruined everything." But Grace shook her head fiercely, because she knew none of this was her mother's fault. Nothing in this quiet disaster could ever be blamed on the woman who had fought every day while the world seemed to stand against them. The room was silent then, steeped in a stillness that felt almost sacred. On the wall hung a thin, curling calendar, the kind printed on cheap paper, where one date had been circled in heavy red ink, eviction day. Exactly 3 days left. Grace stared at it for a long time, her eyes tracing that angry red loop as if trying to peel it off the page with her will alone. Then she turned and looked back at her mother, growing weaker by the hour. She understood with painful clarity that if her mother didn't get the cleaning job at the Ashford group, they would soon be sleeping in a city shelter. She could already picture the crowded sleeping halls, the long lines for meals handed out from the back of charity trucks, the kind eyes of strangers and the blank ones of those who had been there too long. The image was so vivid, it chilled her, even as she stood beside her mother's fever-warmed body. In the corner of the room stood a low wooden cabinet, and on top of it sat the framed photograph of her grandfather, Sergeant Henry Thompson. That man had once been the very pillar Grace leaned on. He had told her stories of the battlefield, though always omitting the worst parts. He taught her to stand tall, to hold tight to kindness no matter the cost, and most of all, he taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of doing what is right, even when your heart trembles. Grace turned her eyes to his photo, then looked back at her mother, and something rose inside her, not fear, but something stronger, something rooted in resolve. She stepped to the bed, gently tucked the blanket up around her mother's shoulders, and kissed her warm forehead. "Everything's going to be okay," she whispered. "You just need to sleep a little more." Then, without a word, Grace quietly opened the cabinet and pulled out her Sunday clothes and her grandfather's leather satchel. Her hands shook just a little, but she moved with the steady rhythm of someone much older. She was preparing not like a child playing dress-up, but like someone stepping into a role that needed to be filled. She scribbled a short note and left it on the pillow beside her mother. "I'm going to get soup. I'll be back soon." Because she knew if she told the truth, her mother would never let her go. When Grace closed the apartment door behind her, the cold from the hallway rushed in like a tide, making her shiver. The apartment was left behind in quiet and shadow, filled only with the sound of Rachel's labored breathing. And in that cold, a 12-year-old girl made a choice to step into a battle that should have belonged to the grown-ups. Grace didn't know what waited for her beyond their front steps. But she knew, without doubt, that she could not stand by while her mother slipped deeper into fever and despair. Something had to be done, and so she did it. As her feet touched the concrete steps that led out into the street, the air struck her like razor blades. She pulled her cardigan closer around her neck, tightened her jaw, and stepped into the wind, arms wrapped tightly around the old leather satchel. Beneath the worn and faded leather were the most important papers, her mother-owned resumes, letters, certifications, and something more. A memory, a presence. The legacy of the man Grace still looked up to as a monument in her heart. Sergeant Henry Thompson had passed away 2 years ago, but to Grace he had never truly left. His voice still echoed in her mind, clear and certain, as though he were walking beside her even now. He used to tell her that you didn't have to be big to be strong. Just keep your back straight and your eyes forward. When you're afraid, admit it. But never, ever let it steer you backward. Every night before bed, Grace would sit beside her grandfather and listen. He never told her stories of glory or gunfire. Instead, he spoke of quiet moments in the middle of chaos, of friendships born in the dust of war, of soldiers sharing their last bite of hard bread, the final sip of warm water, of a wounded young private he once carried through a barrage of bullets during an assault in the Gulf War. He never boasted. He simply said that in the darkest moments, what kept him upright was the belief in doing what was right, even when no one was watching. He called it silent honor. After he passed away, Grace kept his belongings like treasures, his military cap, the half-filled notebook where his handwriting still whispered, a letter sent from a distant camp long ago. But what she cherished most was his memory. Whenever she felt unsteady, his words came back to her like a thread, pulling her gently back to center. When her mother first fell seriously ill, Grace didn't cry. She simply looked up at his photograph on the shelf and repeated his words like a prayer. You can't control your circumstances, but you can always control how you face them. That morning, before leaving the apartment, Grace had stood in front of that photo for a long while. He was there in full uniform, tall and broad, eyes both stern and kind. Around him stood a handful of fellow soldiers, all dust-covered and sweat-streaked. Her mother once told her the photo was taken just days before the biggest battle he ever faced. He saved one of those young men. The boy had been badly wounded, left behind in open fire. While others retreated, her grandfather turned back, lifted him onto his shoulders, and carried him more than 200 meters across exposed ground. A bullet to the leg left him limping for the rest of his life, but he never spoke of it as heroism. To him, it was simply the right thing to do. Grace remembered the way he looked at her when he shared those stories, his gaze deep, as though he was peering through time, handing her something heavier than just a lesson, a piece of belief, a piece of responsibility. And now, as she stood in the cold elevator of Ashford Tower, surrounded by unfamiliar stillness and smooth mirrored walls, she heard his voice again in her mind. When you walk into a room and feel like you don't belong, take another step forward. When someone says you're too young, too small, not enough, let your actions speak. No need to shout. Just stand straight and do not give up. Grace looked into the mirrored surface beside her. She saw herself, small but steady, dressed in her Sunday blouse and pleated blue skirt. Her eyes met her own reflection. No fear, no retreat. She didn't know what waited behind the door of the 52nd floor. But she knew why she was here. She came to fight for her mother, and in some quiet part of her heart, she came to keep a promise to her grandfather. That she would never walk away while someone she loved needed her. That she would climb, no matter how steep the hill. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, like a breath drawn in the hush of the upper floor. Grace stepped out, her small shoes landing on a floor that gleamed with a cold, polished sheen. No one noticed her at first. People moved briskly, phones pressed to ears, hands gripping coffee cups, heels tapping purposefully across the stone. But within moments, eyes began to shift. Not because she made a sound, but because of the stillness she carried. Something in her silence, in the way she stood, demanded to be seen. She was 12 years old, wearing a white blouse buttoned to the top, a navy skirt that fit just right, her golden hair pulled neatly back, and in her arms she held the worn leather satchel with its fraying corners. She looked like someone from another time, like a child who had walked straight out of history into a world too fast to see her coming. And with steady steps, she walked straight toward the reception desk at the center of the floor. The woman behind the reception desk had been there since early morning. She was a person of order, of rules. Her silver hair was cropped neatly, her black blazer crisp and without a wrinkle, the nameplate pinned perfectly on her chest. Martha Helms. Martha didn't need to look up to know that something was off. She had worked at Ashford Tower for over 20 years and could sense disruption the way a sailor reads wind. So when a pair of tiny rubber soles came to a stop in front of her desk, she finally lifted her gaze. Standing before her was a child. Grace stood there, exhaling softly through parted lips, her breath shaky with nerves, but her eyes steady, unwavering. "I'm here to deliver my mother's job application. She's very sick and couldn't come. I only need 1 minute." Martha blinked. In 2 decades of service, she had never encountered anything like this. A child applying for a job. She glanced subtly around, half expecting some hidden camera crew to pop out from behind a marble column. But there was nothing. Just the girl, standing there with all the solemnity of someone carrying something precious. She frowned. "How old are you?" 12. "And you came here alone?" "Yes. I took the bus." Martha's hand moved toward the internal call button. "Young lady, this is not a place for children who've lost their way. I'm not lost. My mother's name is Rachel Thompson. She had an interview scheduled for 9 this morning. I know she needs this job so we don't lose our home. I'm not asking you to hire me. I just want to leave her application." Grace's voice was calm, but her eyes were beginning to gloss with moisture, not from fear but from the tightening sense that the door she had fought so hard to reach was already swinging shut in her face. Martha pressed the call button. At the far end of the lobby, 2 security guards in dark blue uniforms began to approach. One was tall, stern-faced, his hand resting casually near his radio. The other was younger, and in his eyes something flickered, a question perhaps, a hesitation. What was this little girl doing here? No one really knew, but policy was policy. Children were not permitted to wander unaccompanied through the upper echelons of a corporate skyscraper. Grace saw them coming. Her grip tightened around the strap of the satchel. She didn't want to cry. She had walked all this way, left the freezing apartment behind, come with every ounce of courage a 12-year-old heart could muster. She couldn't walk away empty-handed. She looked up at Martha, holding her gaze. "Please, please take my mother's application. She's the hardest worker I've ever known. She scrubs floors like she's scrubbing the world off her shoulders. I typed the resume for her. I know it's not fancy, but it's real. It's the only hope we have." Silence stretched thin between them. The older security guard stepped closer. "You need to leave this area, miss. Without an adult, we'll have to escort you out. I'm not leaving." The words rang out clear and bright, like a brass bell in an empty cathedral. People turned. A few slowed their pace. Some stopped. Martha stared at the girl as if trying to decipher something she had never quite seen before. Grace drew in a breath. "I know this is an important building. I know I have no right to be here. But my mother has a fever and couldn't get out of bed, and if I go home without doing something, I won't be able to forgive myself. I didn't come to make trouble. I came to fight. And in that moment, in the center of that marble-floored lobby where everything gleamed and everyone rushed, a far, 12-year-old girl stood her ground with nothing but a satchel of hope and a voice steadied by love. Everything seemed to pause in that moment, as though the entire lobby had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. And then, a voice, low, firm, not loud, but carrying the unmistakable weight of someone used to being obeyed, rose from behind. What's going on here? The energy in the room shifted instantly. People moved. Heads turned. Martha spun around. Sir, I've called security due to an unusual situation. No need to explain. Walter Ashford stepped forward. His gaze found Grace, and hers rose to meet his without flinching. What's your name? Grace Thompson. I'm here in place of my mother, Rachel Thompson. He didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted down to the worn leather satchel in her arms. He had seen one like that before, a long time ago. And something began to stir. Henry Thompson. The name surfaced in his mind like a memory cracked open after decades of sleep. Henry. Sergeant Thompson. He looked at Grace again, closer now. And in that still moment, he saw it just a trace of a familiar face echoing in her own. He said nothing, only nodded once. Come with me, 52nd floor. Martha froze. The two security guards stepped aside without a word. And Grace, clutching the satchel to her chest like a shield, followed the man she had never met. No one spoke. But everyone knew something had just begun, something far greater than a simple job interview. The private executive elevator sealed shut behind them, cutting off the noise and motion of the lobby like a door into another world. Inside, there were no buttons, only a soft pane of frosted glass that mirrored their reflections, two figures nearly a meter apart. One, a tall man in a charcoal suit, expensive, tailored, marked by time and silence. The other, a thin girl with a solemn face that looked far older than her 12 years, clutching the satchel close, her arms locked around it like it was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of machinery, rising gently like breath. The 52nd floor was not far now. Walter Ashford studied her through the reflection. His grey eyes caught the image of the girl beside him. There was something in the way she stood, in the way she held her chin, not with arrogance, but with quiet resolve that pressed against something in his chest he had long stopped acknowledging. And again the name returned. Henry Thompson. He hadn't thought of that name in more than 2 decades. But to hear it spoken from the lips of a child, it was like the door to some locked room had opened wide, and a bitter, cold wind had rushed in. The Gulf War. 30 years ago, long before there were towers with his name etched in stone, long before the headlines, the magazine covers, the handshakes behind closed doors. Back then, he had been a young lieutenant, with a backpack twice his weight, hands trembling around an M16, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the shell fire overhead. That night in the Gulf War, they had been trapped in a crumbling street, surrounded by smoke and shattered stone. The order to retreat had come too late. A mortar shell had landed just feet away, and the blast had thrown Walter Ashford into the jagged face of a brick wall. He remembered not being able to hear anything, only silence pressing in from all sides, his ears ringing with a high-pitched hum, his vision spinning, limbs numb, breath shallow. At 19, Private Ashford had been sure he was about to die, until a rough, calloused hand grabbed him by the collar and yanked him to his feet. A voice, firm and gravel-edged, spoke directly into his left ear. "Get up, kid. You're not dying today." It was Henry Thompson. Sergeant Thompson had lifted him, slung him over his back, and carried him through the chaos, through the falling ash and broken streets, through gunfire that rained down like metal hail. Walter didn't remember how long it took. He only remembered the feel of the man's back, soaked in sweat and blood, and the sound of boots crunching over rubble, never stopping. When they reached the safe zone, Henry had collapsed onto his knees, barely conscious. His leg had taken a piece of shrapnel deep into the muscle. Walter learned that later. But Henry never once complained. Not once. Ashford was transferred out shortly afterward. He left the military not long after that. Henry stayed, served a few more years. Then he left quietly, without ceremony. They lost touch. And life took Walter in a direction no one could have predicted. He started again with a modest degree, climbed through failures and early risks, and slowly, meticulously, built what would become the Ashford Group. He crafted his empire floor by floor, deal by deal. Through every board meeting, every negotiation, every milestone, he had never spoken Henry's name. Perhaps he was afraid the memory would slow him down, or perhaps more truthfully, he was afraid to confront a debt he had never repaid. But now, standing in the quiet of a high-rise elevator, he looked down at the girl beside him, and she was the clearest reminder yet of everything he had chosen to forget. Grace Thompson. The way she held the satchel. The way she looked him in the eye without blinking. It was like watching a ghost find shape again, not to haunt, but to remind. The elevator chimed gently, a bell as soft as breath. The doors opened to a thick carpeted corridor, the walls panelled in dark wood, and warm golden lights casting a hush across everything, like the anteroom of a place where fates were decided in quiet voices. Ashford stepped out first, saying nothing. Grace followed, her small shoes almost silent against the plush floor, her arms still wrapped around the satchel like a promise. At the end of the corridor stood a wide wooden door. Ashford paused before it, turned, and faced her. "You said your grandfather's name was?" "Henry Thompson, Marine Sergeant. He served in Iraq." Her voice did not waver. Ashford nodded slowly. "Yes, I knew him." The words were quiet, almost weightless, but they hit Grace like a wave. She blinked. "I know he once saved someone," she said softly. "I just didn't expect that. I'd walk into that person's office." Ashford looked straight into her eyes. The girl had no idea she had just reopened a chapter someone had tried to bury beneath years of silence and stone. But he knew, and the realization felt like gravity itself had settled on his chest. "Come in," he said at last. "We have something to talk about." The room on the 52nd floor was unlike any place Grace had ever entered. Everything was vast, gleaming, and so silent she could hear the faint whisper of her shoes brushing across the thick carpet. The ceiling soared high above her, where crystal chandeliers diffused light as gentle as morning mist. Along the far wall, glass stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the endless sprawl of the city below. From this height, even the tallest skyscrapers looked like miniature models in a toy world. At the center of the room stood a long walnut table, polished to a mirror shine. Behind it, Walter Ashford took his seat in a wide leather chair, his hands resting calmly on the desk's surface. He gestured to the chair opposite him, one of several silk-covered seats prepared in a perfect row. Grace stepped forward, careful and composed. She placed the worn leather satchel on her lap, her back straight, hands folded, posture precise. She had never been in a room so formal, so silent, but her face didn't show fear, only focus. The kind of focus that came not from school lessons, but from a life that had never allowed her to drift. Ashford watched her for a long moment, as though weighing his questions before speaking. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Your name is Grace. How old are you?" 12, sir. "And you came here alone? To take your mother's place in the interview?" "Yes. She's very sick. This morning she couldn't get out of bed. She's been coughing badly. She couldn't stand. But I knew this might be her last chance to get a job. If I didn't come, they would have taken her name off the list." Ashford nodded slowly. He didn't interrupt. Grace's voice was even, her words chosen carefully, like someone rehearsing, but he could tell this wasn't memorization. This wasn't performance. Her courage was not borrowed from a script, it was lived. "Do you know why your mother applied for a job here?" Grace blinked. "I think because it's a steady job. With health insurance, we lost ours more than 6 months ago. When my mother fell down the stairs, the doctor said the treatment would cost too much without coverage, so she let it heal on its own. But after that, she started coughing, and now it's pneumonia." Ashford felt a dryness in his throat. In his lifetime, he had heard many stories, pleas, desperate explanations, guilt-laced appeals. He had interviewed hundreds of people. But across from him now sat neither a tearful woman nor a pleading man. Just a 12-year-old girl, calmly recounting her family's collapse with a clarity that left no room for pity. Only truth. "Have you ever worked before?" "I've helped my mother clean at some small offices. I know how to mop floors without leaving streaks. I know the difference between wood cleaner and stone cleaner. My mother taught me every little thing, because she said if I learn now, one day I won't have to rely on anyone." Her voice softened slightly on the last sentence. Ashford didn't respond right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He had watched people with degrees from Ivy League schools stumble through conversations in this very room. But not this girl. She wasn't. Just brave. She had dignity. Not the kind you earn through polished manners or letters after your name, but the kind shaped by life beside someone who had once walked through war and returned with the kind of strength that spoke in silence. He looked at the old leather satchel she still held close. "That bag, it belonged to your grandfather, didn't it?" Grace nodded. "He never threw anything away if it still worked. This one came back with him after the war. Every time he went to a job interview, he carried it. My mum keeps it like part of his memory." Ashford closed his eyes for just a moment. In every word this girl spoke, he could see Henry's shape, quiet, grounded, unbending, no pleading, no theatrics. Just the truth, spoken plainly, left for others to do what their conscience demanded. He opened the drawer of his desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and set it on the surface in front of him. Then he looked at her. "Let me ask you something. If your mother is hired, will she be able to do this job?" Grace raised her head. "I believe she will. She's the hardest working person I know. When she gets better, she won't miss a single day. And if she's still not strong enough, I'll help her. No one will have to worry." Ashford smiled then. A small, thoughtful smile that barely touched his mouth but seemed to echo somewhere deeper. "Do you know that in this company, hiring decisions aren't made out of emotion?" "I know," she said. "But I think, if my grandfather once saved your life, then maybe today, I don't need your sympathy. I only ask that you give my mother a fair chance. If her file isn't good enough, you can say no. But please, look at it first. That's all I'm asking." The room held its breath. Ashford placed the blank paper back down, then stood, his movement slow, deliberate. He walked to the window and stared out across the city, his back to her. He remained there for a long moment, and when he turned back, something in his face had shifted. "All right," he said. "I'll review the file. And not just review it, I want to interview your mother myself. When she's well enough, I want her to come in." Grace shot to her feet, eyes wide, but he wasn't finished. "For now, you and I are going somewhere. There's someone who needs help, and I think it's time I did something I should have done a long time ago." He moved to the door and opened it, standing aside to let her pass. Grace looked up at him, heart pounding. In a morning that had once felt lost, something impossible had just happened, and it had all begun with a single sentence. "My mother is sick, so I came instead." Walter Ashford walked briskly down the 52nd floor corridor, one hand in his pocket, his face tightened by thought. Grace followed just behind, her steps smaller, but every bit as steady. They passed glass panel offices and quiet conference rooms where executives whispered in the cool language of finance. But amidst all that order, something about this morning had disrupted the rhythm of the floor like a stone dropped into still water. Ashford didn't take her back to reception or to a waiting room. Instead, he led her to a door with no nameplate, only a simple number. It was a room no one entered without permission, a space behind his office that few even knew existed. Fewer still had stepped inside. He opened it and gestured for her to enter first. Grace stepped through. The room was small but warm. Gentle light spilled through the windows, casting a quiet glow over a wall lined with keepsakes. Wooden framed medals, a few wrinkled field maps, and at the center, mounted carefully beneath glass, was a photograph that had aged with time. Grace moved toward it. Her eyes locked on the image, and her feet halted as if something had reached out and held her still. She knew that face, instantly. It was Henry Thompson, her grandfather, younger but unmistakable. He stood among a group of soldiers, arm around a wiry young man with dust-smeared cheeks and unruly hair across his brow. The young man's face was streaked with grime, his eyes bright with something fierce and unspoken. That young man was Walter Ashford. Grace didn't speak. She raised her hand and touched the glass gently, her lips pressed into a line, holding back the wave that had risen quietly inside her. "My grandfather kept a copy of this," she said, voice low. "But he never told us the name of the man he saved." Ashford nodded and stepped closer, standing beside the girl as both of them looked up at the faded photograph. "Because I never wanted anyone to know I was weak enough to need saving," he said quietly. "When someone survives because of another, there's a part of them that always carries a strange kind of shame. But the truth is, I owed him my life. He didn't just carry me out of the fire, he kept me conscious, he kept me alive." Grace turned to look at him, her voice steady. "Then why didn't you ever reach out? Why didn't you help when he lost his job, when my mum had to work so many jobs just to survive?" Ashford turned his face away, and his voice dropped into something heavier. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I reached out after I'd found success, if I stepped into his life after all those years, he'd think I was only trying to repay a debt. Afraid he'd say no. And the truth is, I convinced myself he didn't need anything, that he'd be fine. But when I heard your voice today, when I saw that leather bag, I realized I'd been wrong." Grace said nothing. She didn't know what to say. She had never imagined that someone as powerful as Walter Ashford could be afraid. Ashford stepped away and walked to a low drawer at the bottom of a tall cabinet. He opened it, pulled out a brown envelope, and placed it gently on the desk. Inside is a letter. One I wrote nearly 30 years ago. He'd written it when he first heard Henry had left the service and returned to Chicago. The letter had been meant to ask Henry to meet, to reconnect, even to offer him a position in Ashford's internal security team. But it had never been mailed. Ashford had kept it instead, hesitating each day, until time covered it over like so many other things buried beneath work, success, pride. Grace picked up the envelope, opened it, and read the note inside. The handwriting was neat, precise. The letter wasn't long, just a few sincere lines of thanks. A glimpse into a life rebuilt. And one promise that if Henry ever needed anything, he only had to ask. But Henry never asked. Maybe he thought Walter had forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, he carried the same kind of pride. Ashford looked at her, his voice quieter now. "Maybe Henry wouldn't want me to help you today because of that debt. But this isn't about paying back a favor anymore. This is about doing what's right. You didn't come here to remind me of who I was. You came because you had no other choice. And that courage, that's what demands a response." Grace held the letter tightly in both hands. A part of her wanted to be angry, to accuse, to ask why it took so long. but a larger part, so much larger, felt only a kind of quiet ache. Her grandfather once told her that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we bury deepest. And now, more than ever, she understood what he meant. Ashford let out a long breath. He looked once more at the photograph on the wall, then spoke, almost to himself. If Henry hadn't turned back that day, I might have died in the rubble of the Gulf War. There would be no tower, no company, none of this. One man can change the entire course of another's life with a single act. Now it's my turn, and I won't hesitate again. He stepped forward, picked up the phone on his desk, and pressed a single speed dial button. Prepare the car. We're going to the hospital. I want to meet her mother myself. Then he looked at Grace, his eyes steady. And Grace, this time, I won't be late for anything that matters. The black Lincoln, its windows tinted like secrets long kept, moved quietly through the misty morning streets of Chicago, a silent, belated apology gliding past rusted corners and waking sidewalks. In the back seat sat Grace, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, beside the man she never imagined would become the one leading her to a chance that just hours ago felt impossible. Walter Ashford said nothing as they drove. His gaze remained fixed on the passing city, where buildings, street signs, and the blur of commuters moved like fast-forwarded memories. But his mind was elsewhere, locked in a small apartment on the city's south side, where a woman named Rachel Thompson lay in a fevered silence, and where, years ago, an unsent letter had never arrived in time. Grace sat still, not out of fear, but disbelief. When she had knocked on the doors of Ashford Tower that morning, she carried no expectation, only a quiet hope. A single chance. And now she found herself seated beside a man who once served beside her grandfather, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the city, and more than that, a man who had become the first in years to look at her not as a child, but as someone fighting to keep her world from unraveling. When the car pulled to a stop outside the public hospital in the South District, Ashford stepped out first. The driver opened the rear door and offered his hand. Grace hesitated, then placed hers into his. His palm was cold but steady. Together, they entered through the hospital's sliding doors, drawing curious glances from staff and patients alike. It wasn't every day a billionaire in a tailored suit walked into the low-income treatment wing. A nurse at the desk looked up, confused, just as Ashford spoke with calm, unmistakable authority. Rachel Thompson. What room is she in? I need to see her now. The nurse fumbled with the clipboard. Room 11, pulmonary ward. She was admitted without a family member, and her insurance paperwork is still pending. Ashford nodded once and moved forward. Grace followed, her steps quick, heart thudding not with fear, but with something sharper hope. She had never seen a grown-up move with such quiet certainty, never imagined that this man, who lived among glass towers and million-dollar contracts, would be the reason her mother might still have a chance to live. When they reached the hospital room, Grace entered first. The air inside was cool, the light dim. The scent of antiseptic clung to everything. Her mother lay motionless beneath a thin blanket, skin pale, hair damp with sweat, breath shallow and uneven. The sound of her coughing was faint but sharp, like cloth being torn. Grace hurried to her side, gently wrapping her small hand around Rachel's fingers. "Mom, I'm back." I didn't go far. Rachel's eyes opened slowly. She blinked, trying to bring her daughter's face into focus. Then she saw the figure standing just behind her child. Her brows furrowed, confused, until recognition broke through the haze. Ashford stepped forward, bowing his head gently. "You're Rachel Thompson?" "I'm Walter Ashford." Rachel blinked again, struggling to sit up. You're the head of the company. I'm so sorry I couldn't make the interview." "I tried." He raised a hand to stop her. "It's all right. I've seen your application, and I've just learned the full story about Henry." At that, Rachel went still. She turned toward her daughter, then back at Ashford. "You knew my father?" "More than that. He saved my life, and now it's my turn to do what's right. I've been silent for too long." He looked down at Grace. "This girl didn't just take your place today. She made me face something I've buried for 20 years. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number. "From this moment on, Rachel Thompson's medical expenses are covered by Ashford Group. Move her to the critical care unit. I want the best respiratory specialist to re-evaluate her treatment plan. Immediately." Rachel tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks, soaking the pillow beneath her. For so many years, no one had come. And now, in the quiet light of a hospital room, the man who had built empires stood beside her, not with promises, but with action. Ashford looked at Rachel, then at Grace. A mother who had endured everything for her child, a child who had knocked on the doors of the world to save her mother, and himself a man who had finally done what he should have done 20 years earlier. Not to repay a debt, not for legacy, but because some things are simply right. Because sometimes, to save someone, you don't need a reason. You only need a heart. Ashford stepped out of the hospital room with heavy steps, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet, rising flood of remorse inside his chest, like a long-buried current that had finally broken through the dam. The hallway stretched silent before him, lined with pale fluorescent light that painted everything in a sterile wash of white. Behind him, Grace remained in the room with her mother, her small hand wrapped around Rachel's, whispering something soft and careful words. Ashford didn't want to interrupt. He needed air. He needed a moment to steady the storm gathering within before deciding what came next. As the door closed behind him, he caught sight of a young doctor walking toward him from the opposite end of the hallway. The man wore a crisp white coat, clipboard in hand, his expression shifting to one of surprised recognition when he saw who was standing there. "Dr. Huang," Ashford said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command, the same tone he had used in countless boardrooms. "I want you to personally oversee the care of patient Rachel Thompson. She doesn't currently have insurance, and her file is pending, but from this moment on, all expenses will be covered by me. I don't want delays. I want her moved to the intensive care unit within the next hour." Dr. Huang paused briefly, taken aback. "You're Walter Ashford." Ashford gave a single nod, quiet but firm. In this place, in this moment, it was a statement more than a name. The doctor responded with a brisk nod of his own and flipped open the chart. "Understood, sir. I'll take care of it immediately." Ashford turned his gaze back toward the door he had just come from. Less than 5 minutes ago, he had stood in that room and seen a woman so thin and pale she seemed to be fading into the bedsheets. And still she had raised her head to apologize for missing a job interview. He had never seen anyone like her, and he had never met a child who could cross an entire city, stand up to guards, receptionists, and CEOs alike, just to be heard for a moment, not to ask for pity, not for charity, but simply to be allowed to tell her mother's story. 2 women, with nothing in their hands but courage and a quiet, unshakable love. Ashford stood still, his breath quiet. Over the years, he had heard many pleas, seen many people step into his office with stories heavy with sorrow. But this morning had been different. Grace had asked for nothing, only that he look. Just that. A nurse pushed a medicine cart past him. Ashford turned toward her. "How long have you worked here?" "Over 4 years, sir. Do you know the patient in room 11? She nodded, her eyes shifting with a quiet weight. "Yes. She came in 3 days ago. No family at her side. Just a little girl who stayed with her every night. At first, we thought she was the neighbor's daughter. But one night, I saw the girl asleep on a plastic chair in the hall, her mother's cardigan draped over them both like a blanket. The nurse paused, then added, "She's had a high fever, coughing up blood. But the insurance hasn't gone through, so we've only been able to give basic medication just enough to hold her steady." Ashford clenched his hands into fists, jaw tightening. He turned away, but his next words rang out with the clarity of a vow made beneath the harsh white lights of a quiet hospital. "She will not die because she is poor. I promise you that. If she can still be saved, we will not let money decide her fate." The nurse stood frozen for a breath, then slowly nodded, her eyes glassy. "Thank you, sir." Ashford said nothing more. He simply turned and walked toward the end of the hallway, where a small wooden bench sat beside a narrow window. He sat there, hands resting on his knees, and stared outside. The morning sky was heavy, grey with low-hanging clouds, but through the layers of glass, light still filtered in soft, and silver settling gently across his face like a quiet absolution. Inside his mind, the image of Henry Thompson returned steadfast and clear. That old photograph still hanging in his office, the one he used to avoid looking at, had become a mirror he could no longer turn from. Henry hadn't chosen to save him for glory or money or any noble ideal. He simply did what was right. And now, Walter Ashford, the man once carried out of a battlefield by a stranger's strength and grace, had finally learned how to repay that kind of debt, not with wealth, but with choice. A choice that could alter the course of someone's life, and this time he would not walk away from it. Even if it came too late, even if it cost him something, he would act, because no one deserves to die just because they are poor. No one. The morning light filtered gently through the white hospital curtains, soft and warm like the first sigh of spring after a long, bitter winter. Rachel stirred, her eyelids, heavy and sore, fluttered open. Her breath rasped low in her chest, but the room around her felt different. Not the narrow, dim public ward with its peeling paint and clattering carts. This room was quiet, clean, bright. There was a faint scent of lavender in the air. The walls were pale and soft. The bed had controls. The monitor next to her beeped steadily with calm precision. She turned her head slowly to the left, and there, curled in a chair with her head resting against the armrest, was Grace, her daughter, her brave, exhausted little girl. One hand still gripped Rachel's even in sleep. Her golden hair was messy, her face pale from too many sleepless nights, but her expression in sleep was peaceful, unguarded. Rachel blinked. Then she slowly lifted her hand and touched her daughter's hair. Grace stirred. For a second, she seemed caught between dream and waking, but then her eyes opened, and the moment she saw her mother conscious, she sat up straight, her whole face lighting up with a glow so fierce it chased every shadow from the room. "Mom, you're awake. Are you in pain? Can you breathe better?" Rachel's lips moved. Her throat was dry, voice barely a whisper. Where am I?" Grace laughed, and tears welled in her eyes. "We're in the hospital, but not the old room they moved you. You have your own doctor now, real medicine, nurses who switch shifts around the clock." Rachel tried to sit up, but her body refused. Her eyes scanned the room, bewildered. Then she shook her head, slowly. Who did this? Who helped us?" Grace squeezed her hand. "I did, but not alone. You remember the Ashford job? The one you were going to interview for? I went there that morning. I went in your place." Rachel's eyes widened. "You went to see him?" Grace nodded, steady. "Yes, I told them you were sick. They wouldn't let me in at first. But then he appeared. Mr. Ashford. And I told him everything." Rachel stared, emotions crashing through her like waves, shock, disbelief, shame, and gratitude, all tangled in a knot too tight for words. "But Why? She whispered. Why would he help? Grace looked at her mother for a long moment before answering. Because of Grandpa. Because of Henry Thompson. She paused. He told me Grandpa saved his life. Back in the war. He still has a photo of them together in his office. And there was a letter, too. One he wrote to Grandpa but never sent. Rachel fell silent. The memory of her father rose up like a sudden summer storm, strong, vivid, unyielding. She could see his weathered hands holding that old leather briefcase, could hear his voice, steady and calm, telling her that dignity was not something you earned, but something you carried. He had never asked for anything from the world, never once mentioned the lives he'd touched or the one he'd saved. He simply taught his daughter to live with kindness and to walk through this world with her head held high. Now, years later, it was his granddaughter who reminded the world of who he was, not by telling a story of war, but by carrying that same quiet strength into a building where no one expected a child to be. And someone listened. In that moment, Rachel's tears flowed freely, not from fear, but from awe. Because somehow, the man her father once carried from death had come back not in uniform, not in repayment, but in time. In time to save her, in time to remind her that the good we do doesn't vanish. It circles back. And sometimes it returns through the hands of a 12-year-old girl who refuses to let her mother fall. And now it was the act of the very granddaughter he once cradled in his arms that had changed the fate of an entire family. Rachel turned to her daughter. You did something I never had the courage to do. You dared to knock on the highest door. You dared to speak what I was always too afraid to say. You didn't just save me, Grace. You made the world listen. Grace lowered her head, shy under the weight of praise, but her eyes stayed bright, still holding on to the belief that things would get better, starting today. You don't have to worry anymore, Mum. The doctor said you'll be better in just a few more days. Then you can go back to work. Mr. Ashford didn't just help you heal. He wants you to come work for him when you're ready. Rachel cried, not for the gift that had been given, but for the overwhelming relief of knowing that for the first time in many years, she was no longer fighting alone. She gripped her daughter's hand, as if to say she had heard, she understood, and she was ready to move forward. In that quiet hospital room, where morning light was beginning to stretch across the pillows, mother and daughter lay side by side, a living testament to courage, to the enduring power of family, and to the reality of miracles. Not dreams, but a new tomorrow that had begun today. 3 weeks after the morning, Rachel woke up in that new hospital room. Quiet conversations began to ripple through the media in Chicago about an unexpected announcement from the Ashford Group. It wasn't a new real estate project. It wasn't a merger with another global firm. It was something entirely different, something announced at a special press conference held right inside the company's headquarters. That morning, the ground-floor auditorium was packed with journalists, reporters, employees, and business partners. On stage, Walter Ashford stood still for a long moment before taking the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the room as though searching for something more important than headlines or applause. There were no flashy presentations, no charts, no revenue forecasts. All he brought with him was an old photograph and a story. He spoke of a soldier named Henry Thompson, the man who once carried him out of the fire and ruin of the Gulf War. He spoke of a debt never paid, not properly, not in time. He spoke of a 12-year-old girl named Grace, who had walked into the Ashford Tower to keep her mother from dying simply because they could not afford to keep her alive. And then he said that after that day, he could no longer live as if he hadn't seen. We can build more towers, buy more companies, he said. But if we continue to overlook the people quietly sinking beneath poverty and lost chances, then everything we build is nothing more than soulless concrete. Ashford then announced the formal creation of the Thompson Initiative, a standalone humanitarian fund established under the Ashford Group, named for the family that had awakened his conscience. The fund would focus on supporting single mothers and children in low-income communities, offering temporary healthcare coverage, basic education scholarships, and most crucially, real employment opportunities for those turned away elsewhere. It would not simply hand out charity, but would build a true ecosystem of opportunity. Ashford admitted he had grown too accustomed to writing checks. But this time, he would do more than that. This time, he would lead it himself. The Thompson Initiative wasn't a PR campaign. It was restitution, and a beginning. Immediately after the speech, many other corporations expressed their wish to join as sponsors. Several local hospitals partnered with the foundation to accept urgent cases for early treatment. Vocational schools collaborated to provide short-term training programs for women who had missed their chance at education. And it was Rachel Thompson herself who became the very first person hired to work inside one of the buildings owned by the Ashford Group, not as an act of charity, but as a full-time employee, after completing a 3-week training course. On her first day, Rachel stepped into the lobby in her new uniform, her hair neatly tied back, her face lean but her eyes lit up with quiet confidence. She brought nothing with her from the past. No shame, no the weight of what had been. Only her father's old leather briefcase, worn but intact, carried like a quiet reminder of the road she had traveled. Grace, too, was invited to attend the launch ceremony of the Thompson Initiative. She sat in the front row beside her mother. Dressed in a simple dress, with her hair falling softly around her shoulders, Grace watched everything in silence. She didn't grasp the full meaning of the numbers or the contractual terms spoken by the executives. But she understood one thing. Her family's story was no longer a private sorrow. It had become a force, something larger than any of them. She once knocked on the door of a building because there was nowhere else to go. And now, that very building was opening its doors for countless others. Walter Ashford stepped down from the stage and made his way to the mother and daughter. He bowed his head gently to Rachel, then turned to Grace. "Thank you," he said quietly. "If it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here today." Grace looked up at him and smiled. "I only did what I believed was right." In the final light of the day, pouring through towering panes of glass, the three of them stood together, like a family not bound by blood, but by kindness, by sacrifice, and by a promise that had been turned into action. The Thompson Initiative was not just a program. It was a reminder that sometimes one person brave enough to rise can be enough to start changing the whole world. 6 months after the Thompson Initiative officially launched, the 6th-floor auditorium at the Ashford Group headquarters lit up once again. Today marked the first official review since the foundation was established. Beneath the warm golden lights, rows of chairs stood neatly arranged, each slowly filling with attendees, from branch executives and media representatives to junior staff and those who had once received help from the fund. There was no sense of distance in the room, no gap of authority. Everyone present had come to listen, to look back on a short journey that had already carried with it something extraordinary. On stage, Walter Ashford stepped up to the podium. He brought no scripted speech, only a microphone and a thin folder of statistics in his hands. His voice rang, steady, clear, and warmer than ever before. 6 months ago, he began, we started with a promise. That no one would be left behind simply because they were poor. That no one would lose the chance to live just because they lacked a piece of paper from an insurance company. Today, I'm not here just to report the numbers. I'm here to prove that belief, if nurtured in the right way, can become a force powerful enough to change society. He paused, turned to the first page of the folder, and began to read. In 6 months, the Thompson Initiative had reached more than 300 low-income families across the city. 128 single mothers had received skills training and gained stable employment. 37 emergency medical cases were treated in time thanks to an emergency insurance package funded by the initiative. 25 students were awarded vocational scholarships, 10 of whom had already graduated early with outstanding results. These numbers are not just printed on paper. They live in every meal that finally includes meat after months of surviving on instant noodles. They echo in the laughter of a child wearing a new school uniform for the very first time. They rest in the hands of a mother who, for the first time in many years, held an employment contract bearing her own name. Beneath the auditorium's warm lights, there were eyes glistening with tears. Soft sighs of relief rose gently into the quiet air. Hands, once resting loosely in laps, found one another and tightened, not out of habit, but from a deep well of emotion. And then Ashford smiled, his voice lowering, full of weight and warmth. "But if you ask me what I am most proud of," he said, "it is not those numbers. It is the people behind them. It is the ones who once believed their lives had come to a dead end, now standing tall, telling their story in their own voice. It is a woman named Grace Thompson, who not only overcame illness, but is now a regional supervisor in the internal maintenance department. It is a young girl named Grace, whom you are about to hear speak, and who is now writing the introduction for a new scholarship program created specifically for elementary school students." The room filled with applause, not the polite kind that echoes through boardrooms and quarterly meetings, but something raw and thunderous, something that came from the heart. Rachel sat in the front row, dressed in her crisp new uniform, the name tag on her chest shining under the lights. Silent tears traced down her cheeks, but her smile remained steady and bright. She turned and gently took her daughter's hand. Grace had risen, straightened her dress, and prepared to walk toward the dress stage. She was still the 12-year-old girl who had once knocked on a stranger's door with trembling hope, but now she stood as a symbol of something stirring and unstoppable. When she took the microphone, the entire hall fell into a hush. Her voice rose soft but steady, every word clear, unshaken. "I didn't think a single sentence could change anything," she said. "But now I believe it can, if it comes from the heart. I only wanted to save my mum. But it seems my mum has saved many more people than I ever knew." Again, the hall erupted in applause. From behind the curtain, Walter Ashford watched with quiet eyes, his expression solemn yet full of pride. Once he had believed power meant the ability to command, to organize, to lead from the front. But now he understood that true power lies in listening to a child, in daring to change a decision, to admit a mistake, and to begin again. 6 months was not a long time, but it had been enough to plant the seeds of a silent revolution. One without banners, without slogans, forged instead in the resolve to keep a promise, in a name now spoken with respect, and in a little girl who once knocked on a door, armed only with her trust in something better. The Thompson Initiative still had a long journey ahead. But on this day, in this place, it had already become something greater than a charitable program. It was a testament that in a world often numbed by indifference, compassion still had a place to live. And it lived stronger than ever. After Grace's speech, the entire auditorium seemed suspended in a breathless moment. No one spoke. Only the sound of deep breathing and the quiet exchange of glances passed through the room, as if they had just witnessed something words could never fully capture. A senior executive quietly wiped his glasses. A young receptionist gripped the hand of her colleague, and Walter Ashford, standing just beyond the stage curtain, fingers interlaced before his chest, felt the slow, weighty rhythm of his heart. He had listened to hundreds of presentations, had stood at the unveiling of projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but never had a moment made him look inward as deeply as this one. When Grace stepped down from the stage, her smile shy but filled with a quiet triumph, Ashford moved forward. No introduction was given, none was needed. He simply took the microphone, standing in the center of the hall, and spoke with a voice full of reflection. I once thought I had succeeded. I once believed I understood leadership. I thought the world moved forward through effort and intelligence. But then one morning, a little girl knocked on my office door with an old leather briefcase and said a sentence I will never forget. "My mum is sick, so I came instead." That sentence, in less than 10 seconds, broke through every wall I had built over decades as a businessman. It was not a plea. It was not a request. It was the voice of love, of responsibility, of a kind of courage I once thought only existed in books. Ashford paused, his gaze slowly sweeping across each face in the audience below. "That little girl saved her mother," he said. "But let me say this, with all the sincerity I have. She did not only save her mother, she saved me too. I have lived too long in a world where every decision is measured by its return, where promises are often made only when convenient, and forgotten just as easily. Somewhere along the way, I lost touch with what it meant to owe something real. I buried the question I never dared to answer. Why was I the one who came back from the war, while the man who carried me through a storm of bullets lived out the rest of his life in quiet obscurity, unknown, unthanked? And if Grace hadn't come when she did, I would have continued hiding behind the comfortable excuse that I was too busy to do the right thing." He lowered the microphone, and his voice dropped, softer now, more human. "You know, some actions are never too late. But some, if delayed even by a single day, will become impossible forever. I never got to thank Henry Thompson while he was alive, but today I can say those words to his granddaughter, and I can turn that gratitude into action for hundreds, maybe thousands of others who need it now, not as a way to repay a debt, but because if I don't, I will never deserve the life Henry gave back to me." There was a stillness in the hall, held for a beat. Then the room broke open in a tide of applause. Not applause for success, but for truth. For a man who had the courage to stand in front of a crowd and reveal not his title, not his triumphs, but his humanity. Rachel rose to her feet, her eyes brimming with tears, her hand gripping her daughter's shoulder. More than anyone else, she understood that these words weren't just spoken to the crowd. They were spoken from one soul to another. Words from a man who had once been alone in the cold machinery of ambition, now rediscovering the steady rhythm of his heart. Grace turned to her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted you to live." Rachel nodded, smiling through tears. "I know. And because of you, I didn't just live. I came back to life." Walter Ashford stepped down from the podium and walked toward them. There were no barriers now, no titles. Only 3 people, bound together by a story that seemed so small and yet had grown powerful enough to shake the foundations of a system. "This girl," he said again, "didn't just save her mother. She saved me. And maybe she'll save many more. Because what this world doesn't need is more powerful people. What it needs is more people willing to knock on doors with their hearts." And from that day forward, Ashford knew he would never again be the man he used to be. That afternoon, after the closing ceremony had ended and the crowd had long since left the hall, a soft golden light lingered over the empty rows of chairs, bathing everything in a quiet stillness. Rachel, Grace, and Walter Ashford remained, seated in silence, as though trying to slow time for just a moment after the powerful shift their lives had undergone. From that cold morning when a 12-year-old girl walked into a billionaire's office and said simply, "My mum is sick, so I came instead," to this very moment, they were no longer 3 strangers. They were now something closer, something deeper. A family not born of blood, but of something far more profound. The truth is, we don't get to choose where we are born, but we can choose how we continue, and we can choose the bonds that matter most. Family isn't just about blood. Family is where no one turns their back when things get hard. It's where someone stands up when no one else will. And Grace had done just that. A small girl in a vast city, without power or wealth, armed only with love for her mother and the unshakable belief that doing the right thing is always worth the fight. Rachel, once a woman marked by illness and isolation, had returned to life and to work, not because of pity, but through the strength of her own worth. Ashford, a man long surrounded by numbers and contracts, rediscovered his humanity through a child's clear eyes and fearless heart. And Grace, she had not only saved her mother and awakened a debt buried deep in time, but had also stirred the hearts of many, proving that even the smallest act of courage can move the world around it. This is not just the story of a mother and a daughter, it is the story of a choice. The choice to speak or stay silent, to look away or step in, to live only for oneself or for something greater. And perhaps the most precious gift this story offers is its quiet awakening. That hope still exists in this world, if each of us is willing to stand for what is right, no matter how small it may seem. Dear listener, you've just experienced a story that touches the deepest corners of the heart, brought to you by emotional echoes. Did it bring tears to your eyes? Did it remind you of someone you love, or of a moment when you longed to help but didn't have the courage? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Grace's actions? If it were you in her place, would you have dared to walk through those cold doors? We're here to listen, truly, to what your heart wants to say. Don't forget to subscribe, click like, and share this video with those you hold dear, so they too can be uplifted by stories filled with humanity and grace. Emotional Echoes will return to you every day with heartfelt, honest, and meaningful stories to reflect with you on the quiet beauty of life's values. We wish you health, joy, and the warmth of a peaceful life every single day. Thank you for walking with us through today's story. Until next time,